Be Me Chloe, 22. My story is about my dad, or rather, it's about how I never really knew him at all. For my entire life, my father, Arthur, was just there. Like a piece of furniture you get so used to, you stop seeing it. He was the quiet one, the reliable one, the boring one. That's what I always called him in my head, sometimes out loud to my boyfriend. The boring one. He worked some kind of municipal job, something with numbers and spreadsheets that I never bothered to understand. His day was a perfect loop. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., leave at 7:15, come home at 5:05 p.m., eat dinner, and then disappear into his workshop in the basement. That workshop was his entire world. It smelled of sawdust and wood glue. Shelves lined the walls, filled with incredibly detailed model ships. Vikings' longships, Spanish galleons, British men-of-war. They were his only passion, as far as I could tell. A quiet, dusty, solitary passion. My mom, Linda, was the complete opposite. She was the family's engine, the social coordinator, the one who filled the silence my dad left behind. She'd ask me about my classes, my friends, my life. She was the one I called when I needed to talk. Dad was just the guy who drove the car and paid for things. I remember this one dinner, maybe a few months before everything changed. It was a typical Tuesday or Wednesday. I can't recall exactly. I was home from college for a short break. I was on my phone, of course, texting my boyfriend, Mark, about some party happening that weekend. Mom was trying to engage me, asking about a professor I'd complained about. I was giving one-word answers, my thumbs flying across the screen. The silence from my dad's end of the table was normal. He just ate, a slow and steady rhythm of fork to plate. Then, out of nowhere, he cleared his throat. He said he was starting a new model, a big one, the Cutty Sark. He mentioned something about the complexity of the rigging and the type of wood he was using for the deck. I didn't even look up from my phone. I remember typing LOL to a joke Mark sent. Then I just said, "Oh, cool, Dad." That was it. The conversation was over. I could feel the silence get heavier for a second. My mom shot me a look, one of those disappointed mom looks, but I ignored it. A few moments later, my dad quietly excused himself from the table, his plate half full, and the familiar sound of the basement door creaking open followed. Later that night, I was on the phone with Mark. He asked how the dinner was. I told him it was the usual. I said my mom tried, but it's impossible to have a real conversation. I complained that my dad is like a ghost at his own dinner table. I think I even made a joke about how I was pretty sure he was a government-assigned background character for our family. Mark laughed, and we moved on to other topics. I didn't think about it again. This was the pattern of our relationship for years. I'd come home for holidays or breaks, and he'd be there, a quiet presence in the background of my much more important, much more interesting life. When I was younger, he used to try a little harder. I have this vague memory of him taking me to a maritime museum when I was a little kid. All I can recall is being bored out of my mind, whining and pulling on his sleeve, wanting to go get ice cream. He tried to point out the giant anchors and explain how a sextant worked, but I just wasn't interested. I can't remember what he said, but I remember the look on his face. It wasn't anger, it was a quiet kind of deflation, like a balloon slowly losing its air. As I got older, his attempts became fewer and farther between. He'd offer me a ride, and we'd sit in complete silence in the car, the only sound being the low hum of the engine and the radio, which he always kept at a barely audible volume. He never asked deep questions. It was always, "How's school?" I'd say, "Fine." And that would be the end of it. He never pushed for more. I took it as a lack of interest. It never occurred to me that he just might not have known how. My mom was the buffer. She'd always say things like, "Your dad is proud of you, you know. He's just not a big talker." Or, "Be patient with him. He had a long week at work. She was constantly translating his silence for me, trying to paint it in a better light. I appreciated her for it, but I just saw it as her making excuses for him. My life was moving forward. I had a future I was building, a relationship that felt exciting, and friends who understood me. My family, and especially my dad, felt like the past, a safe, stable, but ultimately uninteresting foundation that I was happy to launch from and not look back on too often. He was just Dad. The guy who assembled my furniture when I moved into my first dorm room, working silently with the little Allen key for hours. The guy who would leave a neatly folded $20 bill on my dresser after a weekend visit. The guy whose biggest emotional display was a firm pat on the shoulder. I didn't dislike him. That's the thing. I just didn't really think about him. He was a constant, like the sun rising in the morning. You don't spend your day thinking about the sun. You just expect it to be there. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the library, trying to cram for a midterm. It was my mom. Her voice was strange, thin and tight. She told me to sit down. I remember a cold dread washing over me, the kind you feel when you know the world is about to split open. She said there had been an incident at work. He'd had a heart attack, a massive one. He was gone before the paramedics even arrived. It didn't feel real. The words didn't connect. My dad? The quiet, unchanging, permanent fixture of my life? Gone? It was like someone telling me the sky had been recalled for a manufacturing defect. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember much about the next few days. It was all a blur of phone calls, casseroles from neighbors, and people saying they were so sorry for my loss. I felt numb. I cried, but it felt like the kind of crying you're supposed to do, not the kind that rips out of you. My main emotion was a deep, confusing guilt. I felt guilty that I didn't feel more. I felt like a fraud, accepting condolences for a man I barely knew. The funeral was a sea of faces I vaguely recognized from my dad's work and our neighborhood. People came up to me and told me what a good, quiet, dependable man he was. Every word felt like another confirmation of the one-dimensional character I had in my head. He was dependable Arthur, always on time. A man of few words, but you could count on him. It felt like they were eulogizing an appliance, not a person. A week or so after the funeral, the real work began, sorting through a lifetime of possessions. Mom was a wreck. She could barely walk into their bedroom without breaking down, so the task of clearing out his workshop fell to me. I put on some music, grabbed a box of trash bags, and went down into the basement. The smell of sawdust and glue hit me, and for the first time, it didn't just smell like a dusty hobby room. It smelled like him. The air was thick with the scent of his quiet hours. I started with the easy stuff. Old magazines about woodworking, empty bottles of varnish, scraps of wood. His tools were all neatly arranged on a pegboard, each with its own outline drawn in black marker. Everything was meticulously organized. It was so him. The shelves were lined with his finished ships, the Golden Hind, the Santa Maria, the USS Constitution. They were perfect. Tiny cannons, intricate rigging, hand-painted sails. I'd seen them a million times before, but I'd never really looked at them. I'd never considered the thousands of hours, the incredible patience it must have taken to create each one. To me, they were just Dad's dust collectors. I worked for hours, methodically clearing shelves and sorting things into keep, donate, and trash piles. It was sad, but it was a task. It was mechanical. It kept me from having to think too much. I got to his workbench last. It was a solid block of wood, stained and scarred with nicks and cuts from decades of use. On it sat his final, unfinished project, the Cuddy Sark. The hull was mostly complete, its smooth, curved lines waiting for masts and sails. Next to it lay the blueprints, a magnifying lamp, and a set of tiny, delicate-looking tools. I started clearing off the desk, packing the tools away. Under a pile of old schematics and instruction manuals, my hand brushed against something hard. It was a small wooden box, the kind for holding index cards. It wasn't locked. Inside, there wasn't much. Some old receipts, a few spare parts for his models, and a single, thick, black-covered notebook. It looked like a standard journal, the kind you buy at any office supply store. It felt heavy in my hands. I had no idea my dad kept a journal. He was the least introspective person I knew. He never talked about his feelings. The idea that he might have written them down seemed almost absurd. Curiosity got the better of me. I sat down in his old, creaky wooden chair, the one that still had the faint imprint of his body. The basement was cold and silent. I opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, just like his tool outlines on the pegboard. And the first entry was dated over 22 years ago, on the day I was born. My heart started pounding. I began to read. I read the first entry. He wrote about holding me for the first time in the hospital. I always imagined that moment, if I ever did, as a typical proud father scene. But that wasn't what he wrote. He wrote that he was terrified. He said my mom was a natural, that she knew exactly how to hold me and soothe me. But when the nurse handed me to him, he felt like he was holding a piece of fragile glass that he was sure to break. He wrote, "Everyone says this is the happiest day of your life. I think I am happy, but mostly I am scared. I don't know how to do this. I don't know the right things to say. What if I'm not the father she needs?" I had to stop and take a breath. My dad, afraid, the unshakable, stoic man I knew. It didn't compute. I turned the page. The entries weren't daily. They were sporadic, written during moments that must have felt significant to him. I found the entry about the Maritime Museum. I was maybe 7 or 8. He wrote about how excited he was to take me. He'd loved that place as a kid. He described, in detail, the exhibits he wanted to show me, the history he wanted to share. He thought I would be amazed by the size of the anchors and the stories of the explorers. Then he wrote about my reaction. He said that he saw my face fall the moment we walked in. He wrote about me pulling on his hand, asking when we could leave. The part that made my stomach twist was his conclusion. He didn't write that I was being an impatient kid. He wrote, "I failed to make it interesting for her. I saw the boredom in her eyes. I just don't have that spark that other fathers have. I couldn't connect with her." He blamed himself entirely. I remembered that day as being boring. He remembered it as a personal failure. I kept reading, my hands starting to tremble. The journal chronicled a life I had seen but never understood. He wrote about building a treehouse for me, hoping we'd spend time in it together. But I was more interested in playing video games with friends inside. He wrote about trying to teach me how to ride a bike, and how he felt a pang of uselessness when my mom was the one who finally got me to balance. Every entry was a variation on the same theme, him trying to reach out, and him interpreting my childish indifference or teenage self-absorption as proof of his own inadequacy as a father. Then I got to the entries from my high school years. There was one that stood out. It was short, only a few lines. He wrote that he had come upstairs to ask me a question and stopped outside my bedroom door when he heard me on the phone with a friend. He wrote down what he heard me say. I said my dad was a boring accountant whose only hobby was playing with little toy boats in the basement. Reading my own words, filtered through his handwriting, felt like a physical blow. I remembered saying that. I remembered it clearly. It was a stupid, throwaway comment made to sound cool and detached to a friend. It meant nothing to me. To him, it meant everything. His entry continued, "She's right, of course. That's all I am to her. A boring man who pays for things. I feel like a ghost in my own house. She looks right through me. I slammed the journal shut. I couldn't breathe. The air in the basement was thick and heavy, and my chest felt like it was being crushed. The quiet, stoic man was a facade. Beneath it was a person who felt every dismissive glance, every uninterested reply, every moment I chose my phone over a conversation with him. The guilt I'd been feeling wasn't just guilt anymore. It was a monstrous, living thing, clawing its way up my throat. My numbness shattered into a million sharp pieces. I forced myself to open the journal again. I had to finish. I had to know it all. I flipped through the last few years. The entries became shorter, sadder. They were mostly just observations. He noted my visits home from college, how little I spoke to him, how I always seemed busy, always in a rush to leave. And then I found the last entry. It was dated just a few weeks ago. He wrote about the dinner, the one where he tried to tell me about the Cutty Sark. "I started the Cutty Sark today," he wrote. "It's a beautiful ship. The plans are very complex. I tried to tell Chloe about it at dinner. She was looking at her phone. She said, 'Cool,' without looking up. I don't think she even heard what I said." Linda gave me a sad smile from across the table. "I think she knows. I think she knows I've become part of the background. It's a strange feeling, to be completely invisible to your own child. Sometimes I wonder if I vanished, how long it would take for her to notice." That was the end. The rest of the pages were blank. I dropped the journal. A deep guttural sob ripped out of me, a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. It echoed in the silence of the basement, his silent sanctuary. I cried for him. I cried for the lonely man who spent decades thinking he was a failure because his daughter was too wrapped up in herself to see him. I cried for the little boy who loved ships and just wanted to share that love with his little girl. But mostly, I cried for me, for my stupid, blind, selfish arrogance, for the thousands of missed opportunities, for every silent car ride that I could have filled with questions, for every dinner I could have put my phone away, for every time he tried to show me a piece of his world, and I turned my back. He wasn't the quiet one. I was the one who wasn't listening. As I sat there on the cold concrete floor, my tears dripping onto the dusty floorboards, something fell out from between the back pages of the journal. It was a small old photograph, its corners soft with age. In the photo, a little boy with my dad's eyes was standing proudly next to a much younger man. My grandfather, I realized. They were on a dock, and behind them loomed the massive steel hull of a real cargo ship. The boy was holding a small, clumsily made model boat, and my grandfather had his hand on his shoulder, a rare smile on his face. It all clicked into place. The ships weren't just a hobby. They were his connection to his own father, the one thing they had shared. He wasn't just building models. He was trying to build a bridge. He was trying to pass on the one legacy of paternal connection he'd ever known, and I'd walked all over it with muddy shoes, completely oblivious. The grief was suffocating. It was a physical weight, pinning me to the floor of his workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had completely failed to witness. I don't know how long I sat there, an hour, maybe more. The light coming through the small basement window began to fade. Slowly, I got to my feet. My whole body ached. I looked at the workbench, at the unfinished Cutty Sark. Its bare wooden ribs looked like a skeleton, a silent testament to a story cut short. His tools were where I'd left them, next to the blueprints. His magnifying lamp was still angled over a particularly tricky section of the deck. His chair was empty. I walked over to the workbench. My gaze fell upon the tiny, intricate pieces laid out on a cloth. I picked up the blueprints. The paper was soft from being handled so many times. I saw his faint pencil marks, his notes in the margins. My vision was still blurry with tears, but I could see the diagram for the next step. It was a small piece of the stern, a tiny, carved bit of wood. I found the piece among the others. I picked up the small bottle of wood glue. My hand was shaking so much I could barely hold it steady. I put a single tiny drop of glue on the piece, just like the diagram showed. I leaned over the hull of the ship, the unfinished dream of a man I was only just beginning to meet. With trembling fingers, I pressed the small piece of wood into place. It was the only thing left to do. I had to finish his journey for him.